that I'm really talking about is not so much a boredom as an exasperation at my inability to write. Paradoxically, what drove me to write was my fear that I couldn't. You know, it became so extreme that I had to kind of lance it and reinterest myself and in the idea of working by doing it and keeping doing it.
Would the word therapeutic be one that you dismiss instantly in that context?
Well, only because it's the word therapeutic. I mean, I think just because of all of the connotations of pathology and neurosis that come packed into that term and come packed into people's apprehension of it. It's certainly therapeutic. It's more therapeutic in the sense that any occupation with which people use to define their world and their relationship to the world through that world, I think can be construed of as therapeutic in the more ancient meaning.
What's it like being a shrink? Have you got any really weird, disturbed patients? Do you think I'm crazy? Bill tilts the car up onto Fitzjohn's Avenue before replying, which of those questions do you want me to answer first? The last, I suppose. Christ, the woman knows how to toy. She's a world-class toyer. Bill sits at the desk and contemplates the Volvo 760 Turbo Owner's Manual for the year 1988, perversely enough, the year of his marriage. He has reached the section entitled Wheels and Tires. Bill smiles wryly. He's lost his grip and reaches for the Tipp-Ex. On the opposing page, there's a neat pen and wash drawing of a 1957 Volvo Amazon, captioned accordingly. With great deliberation, Bill applies the little brush with its clot of liquid paper to the word Volvo. Bill is working hard to convince himself that by eradicating the word Volvo from the manual, he will also annul his obsession with Serena's vulva, which has got quite out of hand.
I'll tell you what I've done to my Volvo. I've taken all the Volvo insignia off it. I mean, I haven't taken absolutely all the Volvo insignia off, but I'll get there. I'm going to file the one off the engine fairly soon. And I think it's important that we have less branding in our culture, that things are less identified in that way. I don't think people should have writing on their clothes, really. I've never really trusted a man who had writing on his trousers, especially if it was vertical. It's certainly an interest in things being platonic ideals. You have the ideal three-box saloon car, right? And I suppose in the same way, I was looking for an island.
As he drove south, Bill looked at the sky and the land. He didn't love Caithness the way he loved Albany. Caithness was infiltrated with a palpable sense of being under-imagined. This was somewhere that nobody much had troubled to conceive of, and the terrain bore the consequences in its unfinished aspect. The car was lodged behind a lowering 7-ton truck. Without thinking, Bill checked the rearview mirror and rammed his foot to the floor. The first pass was, Bill reflected, the hardest. It represented an existential leap into the unknown. If car and man survived, they had made their compact for the journey. There were only two ways to do this mammoth run to London: slowly and philosophically, or driving. Bill had opted for the latter. He celebrated by lighting the second joint and hunkered down still further in his seat. It was exhilarating, this headlong plunge down the exposed cranium of Britain. There was the sense that as the car plunged south, switchbacking over spurs and charging down hillsides, it was taking Bill out of the under-imagined world and into the world that was all too clearly conceived of. Fixed in its nature, hammered into banality by mass comprehension.
How hard do you work on your sentences?
Sometimes a great deal and sometimes not at all.
Are you looking for anything recondite, unusual? Words which a lot of people have to look up, to put it at its simplest.
I try not to analyse it. A literary style is, as it were, the fingerprint of the psyche. I tend to approach my writing con brio. I tend to attack the page. I'm attempting to write fast enough not to see what rubbish it is I'm putting down. Before my own suspension in disbelief, which is actually a very frail thing, I find it hard to believe in fictions at all, collapses back to the ground of my own pretension in that way. But what's influenced me most, I mean, at one end I have this ornate Baroque prose that is freighted with coinages and neologisms and obscurantisms in a way, and at the other end I have quite a, I hope, reasonably direct and attacking style, but they're united by a love of exploded metaphor. And I think, you know, the North London Book of the Dead, which we've talked about, the story about my mother dying, starts with the line, you know, cancer tore through her body as if it were late for a meeting with a lot of other successful diseases. And in a way, that image that unites one complete perspective on things with another perspective on things, often in a grotesque and frequently morbid way, I suppose, is a defining characteristic of my style. I mean, I think in the new collection there's a line about a slug of whiskey going off in the rubble-strewn foreground of somebody's consciousness like an anti-personality mine. And I suppose I'm looking for those images that often are, as it were, in and of themselves explosive.
Bill reached behind him and pulled up the car bottle. The whiskey went off like an anti-personality mine in the rubble-strewn terrain of Bill's forebrain. He had more or less gone up to Orkney this time because he was sick with drink. And now Bill felt pushed out of shape. His method of dealing with himself depended on carefully negotiated transitions from being alone to being among others. And as the big car plunged on, Bill gutted the carcass of his own life. About 40 minutes later, at the point where the M6 really did begin to feel as if it were plunging inexorably downhill, down to the south, down to London, the ghost that was piloting the machine took a long final look in the rear-view mirror before lazily circling the steering wheel and turning into an inexistent lay-by.
Apparently flew a trifle too high last week. Scotland Yard is investigating allegations that one of the journalists following Mr. Major took drugs while travelling aboard the Prime Minister's plane, seen here last week. Tory Central Office said tonight that certain allegations had been made to them and passed on to the police. Tonight, the Observer journalist Will Self was fired by the newspaper.
Will Self, the journalist who was accused of taking heroin while travelling on the Prime Minister's campaign aircraft last week, denied the allegations today. He said he regretted that the affair had...
The John Major business, where somebody, as it were, reported that you'd taken drugs on the Prime Minister's private political plane while you were covering his election campaign. The repercussions of that were quite heavy. I mean, it was as if you'd been caught for drug smuggling or suspected of serial killing. You hit the front pages in the way that sometimes seems to happen to writers for reasons which are hard to put a finger on why it happens to some and not others, but it does. So first thing, why do you think it caused so much fuss?
I think the reason the whole sort of scandal on the Prime Minister's campaign